The early June sun in Charlotte was already brutal, the kind of heat that made the asphalt shimmer and promised a long, miserable day. I stood on the corner of Providence and Sardis, wearing a perfectly pressed MIT graduation gown over a suit I'd bought on sale. In my hand, I clutched a cheap, single-stem white rose I'd bought from a grocery store florist. It felt pathetic, a symbol of self-congratulation when what I really craved was a simple nod. My phone buzzed. It wasn't the congratulatory text I knew wouldn't come. It was a photo from my mother, Diana Rhodes, posted in the family group chat. The caption read, "So proud of our Brody getting the tools he needs to succeed. #Lexus RX, #Golden Boy, #Minor League Bound." The picture was Brody, my younger brother, leaning against a brand new metallic black Lexus RX 350, the sunlight catching the ridiculously massive chrome wheels. The car was parked right in the circular driveway of our sprawling 3-story house, the house I'd left 4 years prior. Never looking back. I just watched the last of the uber-black cars pull away, ferrying my classmates and their proud, teary-eyed families toward the airport. My own family had left 2 hours ago in our shared Cadillac Escalade, not to Boston for my MIT commencement. Mind you, no, they were headed to the dealership, making sure Brody's new tool was polished and ready for his big tryout road trip, a trip that might lead to a career in minor league baseball, a career that, in my father Victor's eyes, was the only one worth the family name. I hit the mute button on the group chat. The comments were already pouring in. He deserves it. Diana. What an investment, future Hall of Famer. Not a single mention of my name, the graduation, or the 4 years I'd spent sleeping on a fold-out cot in a library basement. The number 19 bus rattled toward my stop, smelling of diesel and stale coffee. I checked the time. If I was lucky, I could still catch the Greyhound out of the city and make it to Logan Airport for my 3 p.m. flight to Boston, but I was cutting it close. Just then, my father Victor's deep, gravelly voice echoed in my head from the conversation 72 hours ago. The memory was sharp, a shard of glass in my gut. "Take the bus. Callan, your mother needs the Escalade, and frankly, we need reliable transport to bring Brody's Lexus RX home. He needs reliable transport for his minor league tryouts." He'd used the word reliable once for the Escalade, once for the Lexus. Never for me. I was the safety net, the dependable asset you could ignore until the Wi-Fi went out. I stepped onto the bus, the cheap rose in my hand looking like a surrender flag. I was Callan Rhodes. I was about to graduate from one of the most prestigious technological universities in the world, and yet, I was taking the bus because my parents bought my brother a Lexus RX while I had to take the bus to my graduation. It felt like the final, brutal insult. Look at this picture. This is my brother, Brody. This is his new Lexus. This is me. Wearing a gown, standing at a bus stop. I was about to graduate from MIT and all my parents could offer was bus fare. They chose his potential over my proven success. They chose the athlete over the academic. If you've ever been the second choice, the dependable one who gets overlooked, I need you to listen to this entire story. Because in a few hours, the dean announced something so shocking, so earth-shattering, that my parents literally dropped everything they were holding. If you believe true worth is built, not given, hit that subscribe button right now. We fight back against being undervalued on this channel, and you don't want to miss the ultimate payoff. I settled into the back seat, staring out the window at the tidy lawns of Charlotte, wishing I could disappear. The bus fumes seemed to carry the scent of every dusty old memory. Our house in Charlotte wasn't just a home. It was a museum dedicated to Brody Rhodes. From the moment Brody, 3 years my junior, picked up his first baseball bat, he became the golden boy, the family's primary investment. I was relegated to the supporting role, the shadow investor, the one whose intellectual assets were simply expected to appreciate without any capital input. I looked at the worn class ring I already wore. I'd bought it myself the year prior, not waiting for a graduation gift. I had to get to Boston. I had to walk across that stage. Not for the diploma, but for the final, public declaration of my independence. The 2-hour ride was spent in a silent haze. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Brody earlier in the week. He was actually stressed about the Lexus. "It's too much pressure, Callan," he'd confided, his voice strained. "It feels like I have to go pro just to pay off the image they created." I just nodded, unable to offer sympathy. I couldn't sympathize with the weight of expectation when I'd spent my life carrying the weight of total neglect. The bus rattled on, bringing me closer to Logan Airport, closer to Boston, and closer to a reckoning my family never saw coming. The single, pathetic white rose on the seat next to me was proof of a promise to congratulate myself. I was determined that the boy they ignored would become the man they could no longer control. But I didn't know then that this bus ride, this final act of paternal dismissal, wasn't the end of the story. It was the prologue to a public, colossal reversal. A reversal that would make the dean of MIT announce something so unbelievable that it would cause my parents, 1,000 miles away, to drop their programs in shock. This was merely the calm before the storm, the final price tag for the ticket to my freedom. The bus ride was long, hot, and smelled like every bad decision I'd ever made trying to impress my family. But the smell also brought back the faint, constant scent of the lemon-scented polish my mother, Diana, used to keep the house immaculate, a place where the surface always mattered more than what was underneath. My graduation gown felt suffocating, a heavy symbol of a world they never bothered to enter. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the road pull me back to the roots of the toxic favoritism that defined the Rhodes household. We weren't just a family. We were an internal corporation, and Brody was the CEO. I was just the unpaid, indispensable CTO. Brody was the golden boy. Everything about him was loud, external, and required capital. His first state championship at 14 was celebrated with a massive pool party, rented sound systems, a custom baseball-shaped cake, and a professional photographer. When I turned 17 and got my acceptance letter to MIT, the school I'd worked 3 years of part-time jobs and late nights just to have a shot at Victor gave me a firm handshake and said, "Good. Now you don't have to worry us with tuition." It was a dismissal, not a congratulation. The contrast wasn't just in attention, it was in capital. Every dollar Victor earned was a potential investment in Brody's athletic future. Brody received the best coaches, the most expensive camps, a dedicated nutritionist, and a hand-me-down BMW the second he got his license. I got a public library card and a 12-year-old desktop computer I constantly had to repair myself. My mother's praise was the worst of all. "You're so dependable, Callan. You don't need all the fuss. Your success is internal." That word, internal, became the code word for unworthy of effort. I remember my 9th birthday. I just won the regional science fair for a rudimentary but functional weather modeling program I coded myself. I walked through the front door, heart pounding, holding a plastic trophy heavier than my lunchbox. Victor, my father, was on the floor, sorting through Brody's new Little League gear. "That's nice, Callan," he said, barely glancing up. "Can you take this box of cleats to the garage? Your brother needs them packed for his weekend tournament." My trophy ended up on the top shelf of the pantry, next to the dusty bread maker, gathering dust before I even turned 10. Brody's trophies had their own dedicated, illuminated shelf in the den. That's how I learned to measure my value in the Rhodes home, by the quality of my shelf space. The true betrayal, the one that hardened my shell, happened during my senior year of high school. It was the moment I realized they weren't just neglecting me. They were actively liquidating my potential. I'd entered a national coding competition and, against all odds, won a small equity stake in a promising local fintech startup, a prize worth about $15,000 at the time. But with potential for massive growth, I'd named it my MIT Freedom Fund, and kept the documents locked away in a drawer I thought was secure. One afternoon, looking for a specific receipt on Victor's computer, I stumbled upon an email chain between my parents and Brody's expensive private hitting coach. The subject line was "Chilling payment finalized. Brody's elite camp." Attached was a brokerage statement. It showed that my $15,000 equity stake had been sold. I remember the chill that hit me, a coldness that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. My breath hitched in my throat. I scrolled down. My mother, Diana, had written to the broker, "We need this capital immediately. Callan won't need this until later. It's a small asset, and Brody's camp is non-refundable. Please process the sale under the family trust." I felt sick, absolutely hollowed out. I stared at the screen, picturing my mother's neat, polite handwriting signing away my future. She had done it with the same casualness she used to sign a check for groceries. It wasn't just the money. It was the assumption, the calculated, cold decision that my opportunity was fungible, replaceable, disposable, while Brody's potential was sacrosanct. They hadn't just taken my money. They had sold my future opportunity to fund Brody's immediate need. They saw my talent not as a source of pride, but as a secret family asset they could liquidate without my consent. I never confronted them. Confrontation meant opening the lock louder, and I knew that conversation would never end well for me. Instead, I internalized the lesson: anything they can touch, they can take. If I wanted true freedom, I needed to build an asset they couldn't even comprehend, let alone liquidate. That single ruthless act was the inciting incident of my true life. It transformed me from a hopeful son into a shadow investor. From that day on, I understood the fundamental flaw in the Rhodes family structure. I was the reliable asset expected to generate infinite returns with zero investment, while Brody was the high-risk/high-reward venture that consumed all the capital. My love for them, my willingness to be there, had simply been entered into their ledger as a perpetual loan with no maturity date. I stared out the dirty bus window, watching the familiar landscape of North Carolina blur. The houses grew smaller, the lawns less manicured, as we left the wealthy suburbs. I wasn't leaving Charlotte. I was leaving the life they had tried to design for me. That life was built on sand, anchored by a lie. My future would be built on code, concrete, and unassailable wealth. That was the Synapse Doctrine, and it was born right there, in the silence of their betrayal. The 4 years at MIT weren't an education. They were an exile and a refounding. I didn't take a dorm room. The money I'd scraped together to pay the tuition balance after they'd liquidated my stock was too sacred to waste on campus housing. Instead, I secured a graveyard shift cleaning and monitoring the security of the basement IT lab beneath the main library. It was damp, smelled of recycled air and old wires. But it was mine. It was a space where my ambition wasn't an insult, a place where no one was looking for me. My day began at 5 a.m., sleeping a mere 4 hours on a rickety fold-out cot I kept tucked behind a server rack. I was a phantom in the hallways, fueled by 3 things: cheap diner coffee, stale bagels, and the burning cold clarity of my purpose. I wasn't just pursuing a computer science degree. I was building my Synapse Doctrine, a philosophy that demanded self-reliance and the creation of wealth so unassailable, so complex, that they couldn't even name the asset, let alone liquidate it. I met Serafina and Caleb there. Serafina was a design major, sharp and cynical, with a talent for making complex data look intuitive and almost friendly. Caleb was a coding prodigy with a dry wit, whose specialty was network security and penetration testing. We were the unseen trinity, united by a shared sense of being outsiders who understood the language of the future. Our project wasn't a simple budgeting app. It was Synapse AI. It was a sophisticated, AI-driven investment tool designed to eliminate the inherent emotional bias that plagues retail investors. I told my friends, the greatest threat to wealth isn't the market, it's fear and greed. And the greatest threat to my freedom was the emotional tax my family tried to levy. This AI will be immune to both. We worked until the sunrise bled through the small basement windows. I kept two separate bank accounts, one for bare necessities and one I nicknamed the Fortress. Every penny I earned from tutoring, security work, or winning obscure campus hackathons went into the Fortress. I tracked every deposit, every withdrawal. With the precision of a jeweler, I became more intimate with my bank statement than I was with my own reflection. The silence from home was a gift. They were busy. Brody was constantly flying to tryouts, camps, and showcases. The Escalade racked up mileage, and the new Lexus RX was polished weekly. Diana would occasionally call, not to ask how I was, but to get a quick tech fix over the phone or to inquire if I could wire a small, temporary loan to cover Brody's high-protein meal plan. "Callan, you're so good with money," she'd chirp, the sound of her voice grating like sand in my gears. "You're our dependable asset." Just until Victor's next bonus comes in, I learned to say no with surgical precision. My no wasn't emotional. It was mathematical. "The funds are allocated to non-liquid long-term development accounts. Mother, I can recommend a good personal loan company. However, their rates are competitive." The complete lack of emotion in my refusal confused her, which was exactly the point. I was no longer their son. I was a vendor. They couldn't push me around if I acted like a corporation. The tension, however, began to mount during the final year. We had secured our first major private seed funding for Synapse AI. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was massive validation. My financial status had shifted from student in need to potential investor. One cold November afternoon, Diana called, her voice tight with stress, not affection. "Callan, we have a crisis. The taxes, the mortgage, it's all coming due at once. We're short by about $8,000. Victor's stressing. You have some of that seed money, right? It's just sitting there. You have to help us. We're your family." I stood in the middle of the IT lab, looking at the complex flow charts we had taped to the cinder block walls. I thought about the IT lab damp. Quiet. Mine versus the Charlotte house loud, stressed. And theirs. "I understand the urgency, Mother," I replied, my voice steady, the coldness of the code flowing into my tone. "However, the funds are legally restricted capital allocated solely for R&D and securing our Series A venture capital round. Accessing them for personal liabilities would breach our fiduciary duty to our investors. I cannot jeopardize a multi-million-dollar valuation for a personal debt." She sputtered. "Fiduciary duty? What about family duty? We paid for that degree." I didn't correct her lie then. I just said, "I have to get back to development. Mother, good luck." And I hung up. That decision felt like a physical act of severing. It was a clean cut. They were used to taking, and I was used to giving. But for the first time, I refused to let their crisis become my responsibility. I was protecting my creation. I was protecting myself. When I looked over at Serafina and Caleb, who had silently witnessed the one-sided conversation, they didn't offer comfort. Serafina just slid a cold can of generic soda toward me. "Good call, CEO," she murmured, without looking up from her screen. "Don't finance the enemy." That single phrase became my driving force. I was no longer just building a company. I was building a wall, a boundary that was mathematical, legal, and impenetrable. I was building a freedom they couldn't touch. But the most brutal truth was still waiting for me, buried in an old, digital archive. A truth that would reveal just how desperate they were to keep me grounded, and how close they came to succeeding. The week before graduation was supposed to be the victory lap. Synapse AI had just closed a successful, oversubscribed Series A funding round. We weren't billionaires yet, but the valuation was climbing fast, and the future was neon bright. I flew back to Charlotte for what I told myself was a necessary strategic check-in, but deep down, it was a final, foolish attempt to seek some kind of paternal pride before the final curtain. I walked into the house, and it was chaos. But not for me. It was all about Brody. "Callan, you're here." Diana rushed past me, not giving a hug, but handing me a stack of glossy invitations. "Take these to the printer. They're for Brody's pre-tryout send-off. We're expecting 50 people. Victor is already stressing about the catering invoice." The irony was suffocating. I had successfully raised 8 figures in venture capital, and they handed me a chore fit for a teenager. When I found Victor in his study, he wasn't interested in my funding round. He was studying a spreadsheet for Brody's new agent. "The agent says we need a higher commitment, Callan," Victor muttered, circling a number with a red pen. "We're talking $50,000 in upfront costs, non-refundable. It's a sure thing. Your little computer project can wait. Can you wire us some liquidity from your account just for a few months?" I felt the old, cold clarity wash over me. I wasn't a son. I was a bank. "The capital is locked for development. Father," I explained this. "It's legally restricted." "Legally restricted." Victor slammed his pen down, his face turning red. "Don't get too big for your britches. Callan, we are your family. We paid for that degree. Everything you have is because of the stability we provided." I didn't yell back. I just nodded, letting his words hang there, thick and false. He truly believed it. He believed that the 4 years of IT basement shifts, the stale coffee, and the constant stress were all enabled by his imaginary stability. The final blow didn't come from a shouted argument. It came through an old, forgotten email address. 2 days later, back in Boston. I needed a specific transcript and decided to check the obsolete university address I'd used during my initial high school application, the one linked to my parents' family trust account. It was a compulsion, a final, necessary risk. I found an email, dated 4 years prior, from Professor Allister, the head of the computer science department at MIT, the man who would later write my recommendation. The subject line was stark: "Regretfully, withdrawing Callan's application." I clicked it, and the air left my lungs. My vision narrowed down to the screen. The body of the email was a formal, polite reply to a withdrawal notice. Professor Allister expressed his disappointment. "It is a shame to lose such a promising talent due to the family financial priorities cited in the withdrawal request. We certainly hope you reconsider the partial scholarship and mentorship program we offered Callan." Attached to the chain was the original withdrawal notice. It was brief and formal. It read, "Regretfully, Callan Rhodes must withdraw his application to MIT and decline the partial scholarship due to unexpected and critical family financial obligations. Signed, Diana Rhodes, parent/guardian." The ultimate betrayal. My parents hadn't just ignored my scholarship. They had actively intercepted and declined it on my behalf, using the very excuse of financial obligations that they were constantly trying to fund through my savings. The only reason I was at MIT now was because I had relentlessly applied and paid for the second application entirely through my own sweat equity, never knowing how close I came to being derailed. I closed the laptop, my hands shaking, not with fear, but with a cold, devastating clarity. The anger wasn't hot, it was surgical. The 4 years of sacrifice, the basement cot, the endless coding. It wasn't just for a degree. It was to reclaim the opportunity they had tried to steal from me. They had tried to anchor me to their toxic orbit, and they had nearly succeeded. The stability Victor claimed credit for was a lie they fabricated to control me. At that exact moment, my phone rang. It was Diana. She didn't sense my devastation. She was too focused on the external. "Callan, darling, I need you to find a website for a really specific celebratory banner. Brody hit a home run in the semifinals. Victor wants it printed huge. Can you get that done for us? It's really urgent. And oh, don't forget to pack your bus ticket. Don't be late." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt a cold, hard clarity settle over me. The emotional umbilical cord had been severed 4 years ago. This email was simply the final, formal documentation. I walked to the nearest FedEx. I didn't send an email back. Instead, I printed the entire chain: Diana's withdrawal, the scholarship offer, Professor Alistair's regret, and sealed it in a thick, unmarked manila envelope. I addressed it to Victor and Diana Rhodes. For official records. This wasn't a confrontation yet. This was evidence. I slipped the envelope into my briefcase, the weight of it anchoring me more firmly than any family could. I walked back to my lab, the hum of the servers a comforting sound. I thought the bus ride would be the final test of my freedom, but I didn't realize that my family was about to receive a final notice of their own, a bill for a debt they couldn't possibly pay. The stage was set, and the curtain was about to rise on a reversal they would witness, but never share. The Greyhound bus finally deposited me at Logan Airport, exactly 32 minutes before my commencement ceremony was scheduled to begin. I didn't waste a second. I changed in the airport restroom, the rough paper towels contrasting sharply with the fine fabric of my new suit. The adrenaline wasn't a rush. It was a cold, quiet hum in my veins. This wasn't about celebration anymore. It was about the final, public performance. I made it onto the periphery of the MIT campus just as the processional music began. I slipped into my designated seat, Section A, row 14, tucked away near the back. Serafina and Caleb were 2 seats over. They didn't need to speak. A simple, powerful nod passed between us. They were my true anchors, the family I chose. The ceremony proceeded in a blur of Latin, academic jargon, and applause. I clapped for strangers, feeling utterly disconnected. The cheap rose resting on the empty seat beside me, a reserved place for the family that never showed. I was running an inventory check in my head: Synapse AI server status. Checking. Flight status. Checking. Emotional detachment. Maintaining. Then, the mood shifted. The Dean, Dr. Anya Sharma, stepped to the podium. The crowd quieted to an expectant hush. "Ladies and gentlemen," her voice boomed, amplified across the massive green. "We pause now for a special recognition, a recognition that speaks volumes about the innovative spirit fostered here at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology." I barely registered her words. I was just waiting for the diploma, for the moment I could finally leave. "This year," the dean continued, a proud smile spreading across her face, "we celebrate a graduate who, while studying here, managed to launch a company that has fundamentally disrupted the fintech landscape, a company that last night completed its Series B funding round, valuing the enterprise at—" She paused, letting the silence hang. I felt a nervous twitch in my shoulder. Serafina elbowed me gently, a barely contained grin on her face. $1.20 billion. A collective gasp went through the audience. A number like that wasn't applause-worthy, it was awe-worthy. People weren't just clapping, they were rising to their feet, craning their necks. The dean's smile widened, her voice ringing with pride. "And now, please join me in congratulating the founder and CEO of Synapse AI, our youngest graduate to achieve unicorn status, Callan Rhodes." The name, my name, slammed into the silent air like a thunderclap. The crowd erupted. Applause thundered, not polite clapping, but a standing ovation, a roar of pure Boston area recognition. The lights hit me. I rose slowly, my suit feeling suddenly heavy, the flimsy graduation gown now draped over the founder of a billion-dollar enterprise. My focus immediately went to the massive Jumbotron screen displaying the live feed. And there it was, the camera, having panned to a family watching the live stream from home, caught Victor and Diana Rhodes in the dining room of our Charlotte house. They were dressed in travel clothes, programs from Brody's minor tryout in their laps. They weren't smiling. They were frozen in pure, unadulterated shock. Diana's program slipped from her fingers, drifting onto the hardwood floor. Victor's jaw was visibly slack. The pride he'd reserved exclusively for Brody now shattered by a truth he couldn't process. The camera lingered just long enough to capture the metallic gleam of the new Lexus RX visible through the French doors. The contrast was blinding. The final frame of the old story. I felt a dizzying cocktail of emotions. Satisfaction that they saw it, grief that it took this to get their attention, and a profound sense of emptiness. They had just found out that the asset they dismissed was worth more than their entire net worth, more than 100 Lexus RXs, more than Brody's entire projected career. The noise was deafening, yet all I heard was the sudden, desperate, frantic buzz of my phone in my pocket. A call from Diana, then one from Victor. I ignored them. The weight of their fear was heavier, more satisfying than the cheers of 1,000 strangers. This was the billion-dollar silence. I thought about the canceled scholarship, the sold stock, the bus ticket. I bowed slightly. The billion-dollar founder, the boy who still held a cheap rose, and walked off the stage. Just then, a text came through. Not from my parents. It was from Professor Alistair, the professor who had written the email of regret 4 years ago. It simply read, "The investment finally paid off. Mr. Rhodes, I always knew your true value." And then, another text, raw and unexpected. It was from Brody. "I just saw the news. Callan. Holy shit. I guess I didn't need the Lexus after all. I'm sorry. Asterisk." The complexity of it all nearly buckled my knees. My freedom was achieved, but the price was the final, total annihilation of the family I once knew. I bowed slightly, the boy who still held a cheap rose, and walked off the stage. I walked off the stage and into the embrace of Serafina and Caleb. They didn't talk about the money. They talked about the code, the late nights, the stale bagels. "You earned every line. Callan," Serafina whispered, pressing a professional, hand-tied bouquet of crimson roses into my arms, a stark contrast to my single white one. "No more basement IT labs," Caleb said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Only corner offices, my friend." Their warmth was the only thing that felt real in that moment. I spent the next 2 hours celebrating with them, ignoring the phone calls and texts that piled up in my pocket. They were no longer calls of dependency, they were calls of desperation. I knew exactly what they wanted, and for once, I was determined to manage the interaction, not endure it. Later that night, back in the small, temporary apartment Serafina had rented, I finally answered a call. It was a calculated decision, a final, necessary confrontation to set the boundaries for the rest of my life. Diana Rhodes was on the line, her voice unrecognizable, high-pitched, frantic, stripped of her usual composed veneer. "Callan, oh, thank God we've been calling. Why didn't you tell us $1 billion, Callan? Your father, he's not well. He almost passed out. We had no idea you're a genius. We're so proud." The torrent of false pride and panic was sickening. It was like watching a switch flip from cold dismissal to absolute predatory need. I felt nothing but coldness. "Mother," I interrupted, my voice flat, professional. "You are calling an asset manager regarding a publicly valued entity. Your current status is irrelevant to the conversation. What is the precise nature of your inquiry?" The sudden shift to corporate detachment silenced her. "Inquiry, Callan. We're your family, we need to know. You need to help Brody. His tryouts, the agent wants a larger signing bonus. Guaranteed capital. You can save his career. We need a bridge loan, say $300,000 just until the tax situation is settled." I leaned back against the wall, the warmth of the celebratory champagne wearing off, leaving me cold. I pictured the email where they sold my stock, and the email where they canceled my scholarship. "I understand," I said calmly. "Your request is for an unsecured, high-risk personal loan of $300,000 for a venture with no guaranteed returns. But, Callan, we're your family. We invested in you," she pleaded, using the very word they had bastardized. "No, Mother," I corrected her, my voice steel. You didn't invest in me. You disinvested from me. 4 years ago, you liquidated my only seed asset to fund Brody's camps. The record shows that you attempted to cancel a partial scholarship and forced me to withdraw from MIT under the guise of family financial priorities. The only thing you invested in was control and convenience, and you forfeited that investment when you told me to take the bus. The line went silent. The weight of the truth was finally, physically, there. I could hear her sharp, shallow breathing on the other end. I will not be financing high-risk vanity projects, I finished. I will not be your reliable asset. My capital is now allocated to funding the Synapse AI initiative, which supports underserved, highly intellectual students. So, you've forgotten where you came from. Victor's gruff voice cut in, laced with sudden, ugly rage. No, Father, I said, my final statement absolute. I remember exactly where I came from, and I will never let that be my future. My obligation to the Rhodes family is terminated, effective immediately. Do not call this number again for financial purposes. I hung up. The silence was absolute, glorious, and permanent. The phone, which had been a leash around my neck for years, now lay inert. I had done it. I had not just achieved financial freedom. I had unplugged myself from the toxic grid they had installed. Serafina and Caleb didn't ask questions. Serafina just smiled, a hint of genuine pride in her eyes. Good boundary. Callan, now, let's talk about Series C. Their presence, their respect for my privacy, was the greatest relief. The confrontation was over. The healing, the true recovery could finally begin. The call with my mother ended the family I knew. But it didn't end the story. It began the most important chapter: recovery. In the weeks and months that followed, Synapse AI became a sensation. The media called me the shadow investor, the MIT graduate who built a billion-dollar company out of sheer spite and genius. They had no idea how accurate the label was. Spite was definitely the fuel, but genius was the engine. My life shifted from the IT basement to conference rooms with panoramic views of the Boston skyline. But the core lesson remained: trust the code, not the contract signed in blood. Brody tried to call again. I almost ignored it, remembering the finality of my unplugging. But his number kept buzzing, persistent and quiet. Unlike my parents' frantic attempts, I answered, bracing myself for another request for bridge funding. Callan. His voice was soft, hesitant. I just wanted to say, the Lexus is gone. I sold it. I felt a faint flicker of surprise. Why? It was too much pressure, he confessed. It felt like I had to go pro just to pay off the image Mom and Dad created. I hated driving it. It was their debt, not mine. I quit baseball. Callan, I realized I loved the game, but I hated their version of the game. We talked for an hour, the first honest conversation we'd ever had. He wasn't the golden boy. He was just a guy who loved throwing a ball, trapped in a gold-plated cage. He was working a stable job now, paying his own rent, and trying to figure out what he truly wanted. We talked about his college applications. He wanted to study sports management, a way to stay involved without the performance pressure. I offered advice, not money. The toxic structure had been dismantled, allowing a fragile sibling connection to finally emerge, built on mutual respect for honest effort. It felt like finding a small, cracked jewel among the wreckage. But the biggest undertaking wasn't running the company. It was defining my legacy. I needed to ensure my success had genuine value beyond the dollar sign. I needed to counteract the negative karma of the Rhodes family name. I founded the Rhodes Initiative, a philanthropic fund dedicated to providing comprehensive financial and logistical support to students who receive scholarships, but are forced to decline due to family financial priorities or lack of family support. We provided them with the necessary stipends, money for dorm deposits, flights, laptops, and a small, non-liquid trust fund for emergencies. We ensured they had the unassailable opportunity that I was almost denied. I told Serafina and Caleb, my co-founders, about the initiative. They were the only people who knew the full story about the canceled scholarship. We're not just funding academics, I explained. We're funding autonomy. We're providing the anchor that my family broke. My life became a constant exercise in establishing boundaries. The lawsuits from my parents never materialized. They knew I had the evidence of their fraud in the manila envelope. The calls stopped eventually, replaced by the silence I had craved for years. Then, one rainy afternoon, I received a thick manila envelope in the mail. It was the original evidence I had sent to my parents months ago. Diana's withdrawal letter and Professor Alistair's regret. The envelope had been opened and resealed. Attached was a simple, short note from Victor Rhodes. It wasn't an apology. It was a single line of text. Written in his shaky handwriting, "I saw the news about your initiative, Callan. It's a good investment. You finally won." It wasn't the cathartic closure I had expected, but it was the only form of surrender my father was capable of. He finally recognized my success in the only language he understood, investment. I smiled, crumpled the note, and placed the original evidence documents into a safety deposit box labeled "The Cost of Freedom." My life was quieter now, built on the steady foundation of Serafina and Caleb. My true family. We no longer met in damp IT basements. We met in bright corner offices. But the coffee was still cheap, and the purpose was still the same, to build something that mattered. One evening, I stood on the balcony of my small apartment, looking out over the Boston skyline. The memory of the bus ride, the cheap rose, and the frantic phone calls was fading. I finally understood the lesson that had cost me years of emotional pain. I spent years trying to convince them of my worth, only to discover that my worth was defined by the boundaries I set. I spent years trying to be needed by my family, only to realize my greatest triumph was becoming unnecessary to their toxic system. I closed my laptop, the Synapse AI logo glowing briefly before shutting down. I didn't need their applause. I didn't need their recognition. I didn't need the Lexus. My final, most valuable asset was not the billion-dollar company, but the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I own my own story. This whole terrible experience taught me one brutal truth. If you allow people to define your value based on their convenience, they will always liquidate you when it benefits them. My parents taught me to code not just for computers, but for my life, to build systems that are reliable, secure, and impervious to emotional manipulation. That's the real billion-dollar secret. Now, if you've listened to this entire story from the bus stop to the billion-dollar silence, you know that the fight for self-worth is the hardest one there is. Maybe your family didn't sell your stock, but maybe they sold your confidence. Maybe they didn't buy a Lexus for your brother, but maybe they bought his happiness with your silence. I want to know, what was the Lexus in your life? Was it a job, a spouse, a sibling, or a dream they prioritized over you? Drop a comment right now and tell me the moment you realized you had to unplug from their toxic system. Your story matters, and by sharing it, you start your own initiative. If you're ready to stop being the family's reliable asset and start being the CEO of your own life, you need to be here. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. On this channel, we analyze the drama, we decode the manipulation, and we provide you with the strategies you need to build the wealth, both financial and emotional, that no one can ever take away from you. This is where we invest in ourselves. Don't wait for permission. Invest now.